Dear God, please help me to speak slowly, clearly, and to enunciate, and that we may have a conversation with you, with ourselves, and with each other. When I was somewhere between the ages of 4 and 6, I remember despising the beeping sound that the scanner would make at the library during checkout. I didn't like how harsh of a noise it was, and it really seemed quite loud, even though my mother assures me that it wasn't nearly as loud as I thought it was. Years later, I maintained that it was. And for some reason, I just found it intolerable. And I've worked in a library at the circulation desk for about a year now, so I'm no longer afraid of the beeping noise, but I can still remember covering my ears as a kid to drown out the sound. As I got older, I found that in addition to being afraid of the beeping sound, I also didn't like surprises. I did like rules, routines, order, and predictability, and the fact that I would lash out at those who saw fit to operate outside of these frameworks earned me a spot in anger management counseling in elementary school. It was a fun time. While many people I've met tend to look back on these years between 1st and 5th grade rather fondly, I don't have any such memories. I didn't like that none of my teachers followed the order activities that they would put on the board because I didn't like not knowing what would happen next. I was one of those kids. So when I got to middle school, it was as if I had reached the promised land because everyone had a schedule that told them where to be and for how long and on what days, and it was fantastic. So even if I didn't know what was going to happen in a particular class, I knew that I would be there on a certain day and a certain time, and that was all I needed. As I went through high school and my first year of college, I also discovered that I was an uncompromising perfectionist. Mistakes in any area of my life made me feel like a complete failure, and my sense of self-worth gradually became more and more enmeshed with my academic performance. And people would occasionally make jokes about how I needed to lighten up and relax and have more fun and all that stuff, but no one ever really made a serious effort to stop me from throwing myself into whatever assignment came my way, academic or otherwise. I also didn't think it was all that strange, and I even took a sense of pride in knowing that I was smart and in advanced classes and going to a good college, and everyone else was just average. At least that's what I told myself. And then the university I attended for undergrad was full of people just like me. So that only further normalized my behavior. But things began to change around my sophomore year. It was sometime around spring semester when I noticed that I was unable to physically relax unless all of my homework was done. And even when I was hanging out with friends, I found that I couldn't wait for it to be over, even though they were people that I liked, which was weird. Around this time, I had also applied and been accepted to study abroad for a semester in Argentina as part of a program focusing on human rights. And as spring turned into summer, I found I was getting more and more on edge. And 1 month, I believe it was actually 1 month exactly, if I remember correctly, before I was set to leave, I woke up and realized I had so much to do. There were forms I had to fill out, there were shots I had to get. I lost my place and where I was. But there were so many things that I had to do, and they all had to get done now. At least that's what it felt like. So I flew through the day in a flurry of activity and felt super productive. And then later that night, I woke up to discover that I couldn't breathe. Somewhere in my brain, a voice said, "You're having a panic attack." And so I crawled out of bed and kneeled on the floor and grabbed my Bible and flipped to Psalm 91, because that was something that had always calmed me down in the past. But in that moment, as I read the familiar words, "You who live in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shadow of the Almighty, will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust," I felt nothing. No sense of peace, no calming presence sweeping over me, just nothing. Instead, I felt completely alone. I'm going to try to breathe less. Things only got worse from there. I couldn't eat because I was so nervous. I was afraid to drive because I was worried I would get in an accident and it would be all my fault. My parents and my host mom both chalked this up to pre-travel nervousness and reassured me that once I got to Argentina and got settled, everything would be better and this would all go away. And it did, but only briefly. In Argentina, my perfectionism reached a new level of zeal because I had naively thought that I spoke Spanish much better than I did before I got there, and then realized that I was almost incapable of communicating once I was actually in a place where I had to use Spanish to live. I had always been better at reading and writing than I had been at speaking, but the other 3 students in my group were the opposite. They were much, much better at speaking. So they were far better at making conversations and friends and in general, being understood, that sort of thing. So I considered myself a failure from the very start, and I even bought a calendar so I could count down the days until I could go home. And by the end of the semester, I was wound up so tightly that I feared I would simply fall apart at any moment. I began to worry about all the things in the house that could harm me. If you haven't ever thought about that, it's a lot. I've thought about it for you. You're welcome. I went to bed stressed and woke up exhausted, and I began to contemplate what death would be like in terms of having finally some peace and quiet inside my head. And even though I felt like this was something I was pretty sure I should tell someone about, I didn't know how to vocalize it, because remember, I didn't speak Spanish very well. And I also didn't even know who I would tell it to. I eventually did tell my parents when they came down to visit me for Christmas and to accompany me back home, but this conversation took more of the form of me having a complete breakdown at breakfast to really bring in the Christmas spirit. So we agreed that I would start seeing a therapist once we got back to the US, but when we actually did get back and I started making phone calls, there was no one there because it was the last week of December and no one's in their office then. By that point, I lived in a constant state of ambiguous dread and had frequent panic attacks that consisted of the world getting really large, so large that it felt like it was going to crush me. Everything would get really loud and my senses would become overly saturated, and I wouldn't be able to process or think or figure out how to even exist in that space. It was during one particularly bad episode of this that I asked to be taken to the emergency room. Because simply, I didn't know what I would do to stop the panic. I didn't know how long I could continue to live like this while I waited for a therapist to call me back during the last week of December when no one was there. So all of their answering machines had told me to contact the police or seek emergency medical assistance if it was an emergency. And when you panic all the time, everything is an emergency. So this seemed like the best option. My parents and I spent the evening talking with a psychiatric nurse, and we decided that I didn't need to be admitted to a psychiatric facility, but that I did need to start meeting with a crisis management counselor. She was the first person who told me that I wasn't crazy. And my doctor later confirmed that this was in fact quite the opposite. Rather than being crazy, I was just anxious. Specifically, I had generalized anxiety disorder. A huge surprise considering my life story at this point. But this was something that could be managed well with self-care and medication and therapy. And this was fantastic news. When you spend your life waiting for something terrible to happen, but you don't know why you feel this way, or you don't even really know how anything horrible is going to happen, but you just know that something horrible is going to happen, but you don't know why, getting an answer like this is immensely comforting. Because this knowledge is what allows you to begin taking baby steps towards recovery, which honestly could be its own sermon series in and of itself. But for the purposes of this particular sermon, I'll define it the same way that my friend Julia did in a 2014 blog post called Demystifying Antidepressants Part 1, Redefining Recovery. She said, "We're used to thinking of recovery as a removal of illness. And this works for common conditions like the flu, which can be addressed maybe with like a 10-day round of antibiotics. But oftentimes depression and other mental health conditions are more like diabetes than the flu, which means they're chronic conditions that need continued attention. Recovery in this case must be understood as a resolve towards wellness. The thing about recovery is that you're always learning. You learn more about yourself, about what does and doesn't work for alleviating your symptoms. You learn what it's like to live in the world with a disability. You're always learning new things to help you keep swimming, to keep your head above the water, simply because the alternative is rather grim. In short, it's never a one and done deal. So now, after having heard all of this, I'm sure you're wondering what it has to do with Moses and a burning bush, and I'll get to that in a minute. You might also be expecting me to share a miraculous experience of God that canceled out my feelings of abandonment from way back when with Psalm 91. Whether it be when Matthew told me not to worry because I'm worth more than sparrows, or when Philippians told me not to be anxious about anything but to give it out to the Lord. Many well-intentioned and loving people have shared both these verses with me over the years, and while I can appreciate their beauty, I have yet to find that any of my prayers have resulted in a miraculous healing of a chemical imbalance in my brain that causes me to worry about things for no reason at all. And it's not because I'm not trying hard enough, as some people have suggested, or because I'm not believing right, as other people have suggested, but it's because God isn't restricted to working in only one way, like prayer, for example. Indeed, if none of us are ever beyond God's reach, then God's reach has to have as many manifestations in this world as there are people who need help. When I talked with my campus minister when I first got back to the U.S., about the possibility of whether or not I would even be able to come back to school, he told me something that I'll never forget, which is when we feel far away from God, it's not that God has left us, but rather that God is speaking to us in a new way, like with a burning bush, for example. It's hard to say if Moses felt distant from God because the text seems pretty ambiguous about whether or not Moses even knew who God was. This is interesting because if you remember, way back when from our reading from last week, Moses was aware of his Israelite identity when he killed the Egyptian who was beating another Israelite. But even though God refers to the Israelites as my people during this encounter with Moses, I wonder if the Israelites would refer to God in the same way. After all, they had been enslaved for years and their children had been murdered, and it was just now that God decided to reappear on the scene. It was only now that God heard their cries. Although the text does not speak to this directly, if there was a sense of abandonment among the Israelites, it wouldn't be difficult to understand where it was coming from. When putting your child in a basket and sending them down the river seems like the best way to ensure their survival, it's also not hard to see how hopelessness could have entered into the picture here. When you are oppressed by cruel systems based on prejudice and fear, which continue to survive even though they're clearly wrong, it's not hard to see why getting out of bed in the morning seems like a challenge. It seems like no one is coming to rescue you, not even the God who promised your ancestors land and progeny. And in fact, it really just seems like evil has won in this case. You know, in this context of grief then, any way that God decided to speak to you in a new way would have had to been pretty spectacular to kind of break through this sense of grief and abandonment and hopelessness. And yet, God chooses to appear in the middle of nowhere, in a bush, to a murderer who might not even have recognized who God was. That's a little underwhelming, if not just plain strange. And yet God calls it holy ground. The Hebrew word for holy in this verse means sacred. It also means set apart, as in God set apart some land beyond the wilderness occupied by a bush, an ordinary man and some sheep, to be holy, to be sacred. And it was out of this place that liberation for the Israelites would emerge. That's quite something. I think that we as Christians often have this idea that there's only one type of holy ground, namely the church, and that God only works in one way within its walls, for example, with prayer. But if God can set apart ordinary ground that sheep graze on to be used for the purposes of reaching out to those in need, I think that means we might need to stretch our definition of holy a bit. It means we might need to learn something new. Following my diagnosis, God appeared to me in new ways that were remarkably ordinary and yet no less holy. My campus ministry, where numerous friends opened up to me about their own struggles and successes with mental illness, was holy ground. The office of the doctor whom I met with monthly to discuss my medication, who always wanted to know how my studies were going and almost always remembered every seminary I was applying to, was holy ground. The room in the back of a nondescript brick building in the middle of a business park, where I met with my therapist almost every week for a year and a half, was holy ground. Every car and every driver who volunteered to give me rides to therapy were operating within a mobile space of holy ground. And all of my friends who worked to eliminate the word crazy from their vocabulary when I asked them to, helped create tiny sanctuaries in the wilderness of life for me. They learned new things and as I did, and as God spoke to each of us in new ways. Every place where I was treated graciously, compassionately, and lovingly was holy ground. Because if there's one thing I believe we can cling to about God, it's that God is love, as 1 John tells us. And that love, as Maya Angelou says, recognizes no barriers. It jumps hurdles, leaps fences, penetrates walls to arrive at its destination full of hope. Love can always teach us something. So as we reflect on this text and what it means for our lives, we should ask why it took so long for God to free the Israelites. We should also ask why there are so many people in this world today who continue to face unjust oppression from racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, ableism, and other manifestations of fear that far too often become manifestations of violence. We should also ask why they are not free and how God might be speaking to us in new ways to be agents of liberation and love, like Moses. Did God really forget to free the Israelites all those years? Did God really forget their covenant? Or did we as humans forget that it's wrong to oppress another person fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God? If God can always work in new ways and can set aside anywhere as holy ground for the purposes of healing and liberation, you can call ordinary people to help. What are we waiting for? More importantly, whose voices are we ignoring who are trying to teach us new things? Elizabeth Barrett Browning says, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries." Holy ground is everywhere because nowhere is beyond God's reach. We only have to listen to how God is speaking to us in new ways in order to recognize it. Amen.